My name is Douglas Hale. I am 58 years old. And last Monday morning at 9:47, my son stood in a conference room on the 4th floor of a building I built from nothing, staring at a photograph of me on a projection screen. While his new manager explained the founding story of the company my son had just been hired to work for. He did not know. I want to say that again, because it is the part that people find hardest to believe. My son, 31 years old, college educated, sharp in the specific way of a person who has always been the smartest person in whatever room he walked into, did not know that the company he had spent 6 weeks interviewing for, the company he had accepted an offer from, the company whose orientation he was sitting in on a Monday morning in a room with 12 other new hires, was mine. He had my last name. The company did not. I changed it in 2004 when I restructured for reasons I will explain, and the name has been Calloway Integrated Services ever since, which tells you nothing about Douglas Hale of Macon, Georgia, which is where I started. He turned slowly and looked at me in the back row. I raised my coffee cup. His manager, a good man named Phil Garrett, who has been with me for 11 years and who knew exactly what was happening, kept talking. This is that story. Let me start from the beginning. I grew up in Warner Robins, Georgia. My father, Earl Hale, drove a delivery truck for a wholesale grocery distributor for 31 years. My mother, June, worked the register at a hardware store until her feet gave out, and then she worked the phone. We were not poor in the way that has a name. We were the kind of not poor where the bills got paid and the heat stayed on and there was always food, but there was never margin. No margin for error, no margin for extra, no margin for the kind of thinking that reaches past next month. I was good at school in the way that boys from families like mine are sometimes good at school, not because anyone around me was particularly focused on it, but because I understood early that it was one of the few games where effort produced results regardless of where you started. I won a partial scholarship to Georgia Tech, studied mechanical engineering, worked 20 hours a week the entire 4 years at a machine shop in Marietta, partly for the money and partly because I liked the work, the specific satisfaction of things that fit together correctly and performed the way they were designed to perform. I graduated in 1988, took a job with a mid-sized facilities management company out of Atlanta called Brentwood Services. Did that for 6 years. Learned everything I could about how large commercial buildings were maintained, contracted, and managed. Learned what the clients actually needed versus what they said they needed. Learned where the money went and where it leaked out and where it could be recovered with better systems. In 1994, I was 30 years old, and I had saved $47,000, and I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. I started Hale Facilities Group out of a 2-room office in Macon with 1 truck, 1 contract, and 1 employee, a retired HVAC technician named Boyd Simmons, who was 61 years old and knew more about commercial climate systems than anyone I have met before or since. Boyd worked for me for 9 years until he retired for good. I went to his retirement party, and he told me in front of everyone that I was the best boss he ever had, which is not something I say to make myself look good. I say it because Boyd was the kind of man whose opinion was worth more than most people's, and I have been trying to deserve it ever since. The first 3 years were what the first 3 years of any service business are: relentless. I worked 6 days a week and was available by phone on the 7th. I drove the truck myself when a technician called out. I did estimates on Saturday mornings and invoicing on Sunday nights. I missed things I should not have missed and was present for things that mattered, and I got it wrong in the ratio that most people get it wrong when they are building something real from the ground up, which is to say more times than they planned for and fewer times than would have finished them. In 1997, I landed a contract with a hospital system in central Georgia. 3 facilities, preventive maintenance, emergency response, the whole scope. It was the biggest contract I had ever signed. It was also bigger than my current capacity, which I addressed by hiring 4 people in 2 weeks and sleeping approximately 5 hours a night for the following 4 months. We delivered on time, under budget, with a quality score that got me a referral to another hospital in the same system the following year. That referral became 2 more contracts. Those contracts became relationships. Those relationships became the engine that grew Hale Facilities Group from a 2-room office in Macon to a regional operation with offices in Atlanta, Savannah, and Charlotte, 47 employees, and annual revenue that I will not specify here, but that represented, by 2002, more than I had ever imagined earning in a single year when I was driving that truck for Boyd at 6 in the morning. I married my wife Karen in 1996. She was a nurse. She was practical and funny and had the specific quality of a person who tells you the truth without drama, which is rarer than it sounds and more valuable than most people know until they have gone without it. We had our son Nathan in 1997. We had our daughter Lily in 2000. I want to tell you something about Karen that matters for this story. She was the one who understood before I did what the company was becoming, not in terms of revenue or contracts or regional footprint, in terms of what it was going to cost. She watched me work the hours and miss the dinners and take the calls, and she never complained, not once, not in the way of a woman who is keeping a tally. She complained once, clearly, directly, in the specific way she did everything. When Nathan was 6 years old and asked her at breakfast where Daddy was, and she said working, and he said, Daddy is always working, and she called me that morning and said, Douglas, I need you to hear something, and she told me what he said. I left the office at 4 o'clock that day. I was home for dinner. It was the first time in 11 months. I did not fix it all at once. I fixed it incrementally, the way you fix anything structural, which is to say carefully and with attention to what you are doing and acceptance that some of the damage was already done. Nathan and I found our way to each other in the years that followed, mostly through baseball, which he played with a seriousness that I admired, and through the long drives to away games where we talked in the way that fathers and sons sometimes only talk when they are moving and not looking at each other. Lily was easier in the way that second children are sometimes easier, which is to say I was better at it by then, and she and I have always understood each other with a directness that requires less maintenance than most relationships. In 2004, I made the decision that changed the shape of everything. A private equity group out of Nashville had been approaching me for 18 months about acquiring Hale Facilities Group. The numbers they were putting on the table were significant, not retire and disappear numbers, but significant. The deal they were proposing was not a full acquisition. It was a recapitalization. They would take a majority stake, bring capital for expansion, and I would remain as CEO with meaningful equity and an earn-out tied to 5-year performance targets. I spent 4 months with lawyers and accountants and 2 advisors I trusted before I agreed. As part of the recapitalization, the company was rebranded. The private equity group had a standard practice of moving away from founder name branding when they came in, on the theory that it created key man risk and complicated eventual exit. I understood the logic. I did not love it, but I understood it. Hale Facilities Group became Calloway Integrated Services. Calloway was the street in Nashville where the PE firm's founding partner had grown up. It meant nothing to me. It also meant that the company I had built was now operating under a name that did not connect back to Douglas Hale of Warner Robins, Georgia, in any way that a person doing casual research would find. I bought back the majority stake in 2011 when the PE group exited. By then, the company had expanded into 6 states, had 340 employees, and was doing the kind of revenue that I described to very few people, because the number is not the point and never was. The name stayed Calloway. I had thought about changing it back. I decided against it. The company had built its own reputation under that name, and reputation is not a thing you reset without cost. Karen died in 2018. Pancreatic cancer. 11 months from diagnosis to the morning in October when I was holding her hand in the hospital and she was gone. She was 54 years old. She was the person who called me when Nathan was 6 and made me hear something I needed to hear. She was the person who told me the truth without drama for 22 years. She was the person who made it possible for me to build what I built and still be the kind of father my children could find when they needed to. I am not going to tell you about the year after she died, not because I cannot, but because this story is not about that year, and the people who have been through it know what it contains, and the people who have not been through it will understand it when they do. Nathan was 22 when Karen died. He finished his degree, a business degree from Georgia State, 6 months later. He took a job with a supply chain consulting firm in Atlanta. He was good at it. He moved up quickly, the way sharp people move up when they are also willing to work, which Nathan always was, in the specific inherited way of a son who watched his father work before he understood what working meant. He and I talked regularly. We had Sunday phone calls and occasional dinners, and the easy shorthand of two people who had found their way back to each other through baseball and long drives, and the shared loss of Karen, which had, in the strange arithmetic of grief, brought us closer than we had been since he was 12. What I did not do in any of those conversations was tell him about Calloway. I want to explain that, not justify it. Explain it. When Karen died, Nathan and Lily were both doing the particular work of becoming themselves without the person who had held the center of the family together. I did not want my company, my money, my position to be the thing that colored how they were doing that work. I did not want Nathan looking at a career decision and thinking about what I had or what he might inherit or what it meant to be Douglas Hale's son in the professional context rather than the personal one. I wanted him to build something of his own the way I had built something of my own, not with my resources at his back, but with his own effort and his own judgment and his own proof. This was perhaps not the right call. I am aware of that. I am not presenting it as wisdom. I am presenting it as the decision I made and the reasoning I had at the time. What I did not anticipate was that Nathan would apply to Calloway. He told me about the opportunity on a Sunday call in the fall. He had been looking for a move, something with more scope than the consulting firm, and a recruiter had reached out about a regional director role with a facilities management company operating across the Southeast. Good base, meaningful equity component, real operational responsibility. He said the company was called Calloway Integrated Services. He said he had done his research and the operation looked solid and the culture seemed like the kind he wanted to work in. I sat with the phone in my hand and I made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. I said, that sounds like a good opportunity. I said nothing else. He went through 6 weeks of interviews, 4 rounds, 2 in-person visits to the Atlanta office, a presentation to the leadership team that Phil Garrett told me afterward was one of the best they had seen from a candidate at that level. He did not know he was presenting to a room that included 2 people who reported directly to me, because I was careful about that, and Phil was careful about that, because I had explained the situation to Phil when Nathan's resume came across as a referral from the recruiter, which is a call I received with a feeling I am still not sure I have fully named. Nathan was evaluated on his own merits. I want to be clear about that because it is the part that matters most to me in how I tell this story. He went through the same process as every other candidate. His scores were his scores. His presentation was his presentation. The offer he received was the offer that his performance in the process warranted. Phil confirmed that to me directly, and I trust Phil in the way you trust someone who has been honest with you through 11 years of decisions that cost something. Nathan accepted the offer on a Thursday afternoon. He called me Sunday. He said he had taken a new job starting in 2 weeks, and he was excited about it and a little nervous and that it felt like the right move. I asked him what the company did. He explained it. I asked a few questions in the way of a father who is interested. He answered them. He said it felt like a place where he could build something real. I said I thought that sounded exactly right. I did not sleep well that night. The Monday of the orientation. I arrived early. Phil had arranged it so that I could sit in on the orientation session under the cover of a routine leadership observation, which was something I actually did twice a year with new hire cohorts. So it was not unusual for Calloway. What was unusual was that I sat in the back row instead of at the front, and that I was there specifically to see my son's face when he arrived. He walked in at 8:52 with a cup of coffee and the particular expression of a person who is calibrating a new environment, taking in the room, the people, the texture of the place. He found a seat in the third row. He put his coffee down. He took out a notepad, which is something Karen used to do in every meeting she ever attended. Always a physical notepad, always a pen with actual ink. I sat in the back row and watched him settle in, and I thought about a boy asking where Daddy was at breakfast, and about long drives to baseball games, and about a phone call I received when his resume came across my desk, and about Karen, who would have understood what was happening here and probably would have engineered the whole thing better than I did and felt less complicated about it. Phil opened the orientation at 9. Standard welcome, logistics, introductions around the table, 12 new hires. Nathan was the most senior in terms of role, the only one coming in at director level. Phil handled it the way Phil handles everything, organized and direct, and with the specific warmth of a person who actually likes the work of building a team. At 9:35, Phil moved into the company history section. He put up the first slide. I have given this presentation myself. I know it by memory. The early years, the founding contract, the hospital system relationship, the growth through referrals, the recapitalization in 2004, the buyback in 2011, the current footprint. It is a good story. Phil tells it well, which is one of the reasons I have had him tell it at orientations for the past 4 years. At 9:42, Phil put up the photograph. It is from 1997. I am 33 years old in it. I am standing in front of the truck, the first truck, the one I drove myself for the first 18 months, outside the original Macon office. I am wearing a Hale Facilities Group polo shirt. I am holding a coffee cup, which was not staged, but which Phil and I have laughed about for years, given how it looks in retrospect. I am squinting slightly because the morning sun was directly in my face, and Boyd, who took the picture, did not wait for me to adjust. Phil said, "This is Douglas Hale, who founded the company in 1994 in Macon, Georgia. Before we were Calloway, we were Hale Facilities Group, and everything this company was built by this man, starting with one truck, one contract, and one technician who knew more about HVAC systems than anyone alive." I was watching Nathan. I saw the moment he saw the photograph. He went still in the specific way that people go still when their brain receives information it does not have a category for, not a flinch, not a visible reaction, just a stopping, a pause in the normal forward motion of a person sitting in a meeting. His coffee cup was halfway to his mouth, and it stayed there for 2 full seconds. Then he looked at the photograph for a long time. 7 seconds. I counted. 7 seconds of looking at a photograph of a 33-year-old man standing in front of a truck in Macon, Georgia in 1997 and understanding something that rearranged the shape of everything he thought he knew. Then he turned around, slowly, the way you turn when you are not sure what you're going to see, but you already know. I was in the back row with my coffee cup. I raised it, the same cup, different coffee, same gesture as the photograph on the screen. His face did something I do not have a precise word for. Not anger, not joy, not the particular expression of a man who has just been deceived by someone he trusted. Something more complicated than any of those. Something that contained all of them, and also something older. Something that had to do with a boy who asked where Daddy was at breakfast, and a man who had driven to his baseball games and a Sunday call 7 weeks ago, where his father said, "That sounds like a good opportunity," and left it there. Phil, to his considerable credit, kept talking. He did not miss a beat. He moved to the next slide. He continued with the timeline. He is a professional, and he knew what was happening in the back of the room, and he understood that his job in that moment was to keep the room's attention forward, which he did. Nathan turned back around. He sat in his chair for the next 22 minutes without moving. The orientation broke for coffee at 10:15. 11 of the 12 new hires stood and stretched and moved toward the credenza at the side of the room. Nathan sat in his chair for a moment. Then he stood. He did not go to the credenza. He walked to the back of the room. He sat down in the chair next to mine. He did not say anything for a moment. I did not say anything either. Then he said, "How long?" I said, "The company, 30 years. Under this name, 21. He said, "No. How long have you known I was coming here?" I said, "Since your resume came across as a referral, 6 weeks before your first interview." He said, "You didn't say anything." I said, "No." He said, "For 6 weeks." I said, "Yes." He was quiet. He was looking at the table in front of him, not at me. I let him look. He said, "The interviews, the panel, the presentation." I said, "Were yours?" "All of it." I did not touch the process. Phil can confirm that. Your scores were your scores. He said, "Phil knew." I said, "Phil knew," because I had to tell him when your name came up. He ran the process independently. He would have given you the same offer or passed on you the same as any other candidate. He passed on 2 people at your level in the last cycle who did not meet the bar. Nathan was quiet. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" This was the question I had been thinking about for 6 weeks. The real one, not the logistics of what happened or the mechanics of the process, but the actual question underneath it. "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because I wanted to know if you could get here on your own, not for my sake, for yours. You have grown up knowing I had resources. You have always been careful not to use them, which I respect, but there is a difference between not using something and not knowing whether you could have gotten somewhere without it. I wanted you to know." He said, "You could have just told me and let me make the choice." I said, "I could have." "You're right about that." He said, "So why didn't you?" I thought about Karen. I thought about what she would have said. I thought about the truth without drama, which was her gift and not mine. I said, "Because I was afraid you would have withdrawn from the process to avoid the appearance of advantage, and then you would never have known what the process said about you. And what the process said about you is something you should know." He looked at me for the first time since he had sat down. He said, "What did it say?" I said, "Phil called it one of the best director-level candidates he had seen in 4 years, not because of who your father is, because of how you think and how you present and how you handle a room when the room is evaluating you. That was you. No one in that process knew whose son you were." He was quiet for a long time. The 11 other new hires were still at the credenza. Phil was giving one of the new hires a building tour. The room was almost empty. Nathan said, "I'm sitting here trying to figure out if I'm angry." I said, "That seems reasonable." He said, "Are you going to tell me I shouldn't be?" I said, "No. You get to decide how you feel about what I did. I am telling you what I did and why I did it. What you do with that is yours." He looked at the projection screen, which still had the company timeline on it. The photograph of me at 33 was 3 slides back. He looked at the screen for a moment, and then he looked at his coffee cup. He said, "That photo. You're holding the cup." I said, "Boyd took it. I didn't know he was taking it. The sun was in my face." He said, "Boyd Simmons." I said, "You remember Boyd?" He said, "You talked about him for years. You went to his retirement party when I was 12. I said, "Yes." He said, "He came to Mom's funeral." I said, "He drove 4 hours. He did not tell me he was coming." Nathan looked at the table. He said, "She would have something to say about this." I said, "She would have said it better than I did. She would have also told you 6 weeks ago, which is probably what I should have done." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He said, "Probably." He said, "This is a strange morning." I said, "It is." He said, "Phil just kept talking." I said, "Phil is a professional. He said he didn't even slow down. I said he knew what was happening. He also knew his job was to keep the room moving. Nathan looked at the credenza. The other new hires were drifting back to their seats. Phil would be back in a few minutes. He said, I need to go back to my seat. I said, I know. He said, I need to actually do this orientation. I said, yes, you do. He said, are we going to talk about this? I said, yes, but not here and not now. Dinner, this week. He said, does Lily know? I said, no. He said, she is going to have things to say. I said, I know. He stood up. He picked up his coffee cup. He straightened his jacket in the way that Karen used to straighten her coat before she walked into a room. That particular small self-gathering gesture. He said, you couldn't have just told me. I said, I should have. I'm telling you now. He looked at me for a moment. I looked back. We are not a family that has ever required a great deal of words for the things that matter most. That was a gift from Karen, who believed that the space between people could carry as much as the words. He went back to his seat. I sat in the back row for the remainder of the orientation. Phil came and sat next to me when the session broke for the building tour. He said, how'd it go? I said, he's not angry. He's figuring out if he should be. Phil said, smart kid. I said, he's his mother's son. Phil said, he's yours too, Doug. I looked at the empty chairs, at the projection screen, which was dark now. I said, he got the job on his own? Phil said, he got the job on his own. I said, good. Phil said, for what it's worth, if his name had been Nathan, anybody else, he would have had the same offer on the same terms. Maybe a day earlier, because we wouldn't have had to manage the situation, but the same offer. I said, that's worth something. Phil said, I thought you should hear it again. We had dinner on Thursday. Italian place in Buckhead that Karen and I had gone to twice, once before Nathan was born and once for our 15th anniversary. I had not been back since she died. I chose it anyway because some places deserve to be returned to. Nathan was there when I arrived. He had a glass of water and a bread roll, and the particular stillness of a man who has been sitting alone long enough to have worked through several versions of what he wants to say. We ordered, we ate some bread. We went back and forth for a while on the easy things, the apartment he was moving into, the building tour from orientation, a technician from the Charlotte office Phil had introduced him to, who Nathan thought was exceptional. Then Nathan set down his bread roll and said, I want to tell you something. I said, okay. He said, I'm not angry. I worked through it. What you did was not the way I would have done it, but I understand why you did it, and I want you to know that I understand. I said, thank you. He said, but I want to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. I said, go ahead. He said, all those Sunday calls, all those dinners, all that time when you knew what I was interviewing for and you asked me questions about it like you didn't, was that hard? I looked at him across the table. I said, yes. He said, how hard? I said, the Sunday before your final round presentation, when you called me and went through your talking points because you wanted to practice, and I sat on the phone and listened to you pitch my own company back to me and told you it was good. That was the hardest phone call I have had since your mother died. He was quiet. He said, why didn't you stop it then? I said, because you were ready. I could hear it, and stopping it would have been for my comfort, not yours. He picked up his water glass. He held it for a moment. He said, she would have stopped it. I said, she would have told you in the first week and worked out the details after. That was her way. He said, and you let it run. I said, I let it run. He said, because you needed to see. I said, because I needed you to see. He put the water glass down. He said, I got the job. I said, you got the job. He said, on my own. I said, on your own, with your own preparation and your own judgment and your own ability to stand in a room and make people believe in what you are saying. Phil ran a clean process. You want it clean. He looked at the table. He said, I know what that took from you to let happen. I said, I am not sure you do, entirely. He said, I know you. I know that watching me go through something that could have gone wrong and not intervening is not something that comes naturally to you. I said, no, it does not. He said, but you let it run. I said, I let it run. He said, okay. He picked up his fork. He ate a piece of bread. He said, I have a question about the Charlotte office. And we talked about the Charlotte office for 20 minutes, the way two people talk about a business when one of them owns it and the other one has just started there, and they are both still finding the right language for what they are to each other in this new configuration. It was, I realized about halfway through the conversation, the first time in 30 years that I had talked about my company with someone in my family. Karen knew the broad shape of it. Lily knew I ran something. Nathan had known I had resources without knowing specifically what they were. And now, here was my son, talking about the Charlotte office with the specific informed interest of someone who had done his research, asking about the service model and the client concentration and the technician retention issue that Phil had mentioned during orientation. He had done his research. Of course he had. That was Nathan. That was his mother. I answered his questions. He asked good ones. At the end of the dinner, when the check came, Nathan put his hand over it. He said, I have a job now. I said, I know you do. He said, a real one. I said, the realest one you have had. He said, let me get it. I let him get it. Here is what I know now that I did not know 30 years ago when I signed a lease on a 2-room office in Macon with Boyd Simmons and 1 truck. I know that building a company is not the hardest thing a man can do. The hardest thing is being present for the people you are building it for, at the right moments, in the right way, with enough of yourself left over to be recognizable to them as a person and not just a function. I failed at that in Nathan's early years. I was better at it later. Karen made me better at it by making me hear the things I needed to hear before I was ready to hear them. She was like that, efficient, accurate, with a kindness that made the accuracy bearable. I know that what I did, keeping the Calloway situation from Nathan for 6 weeks, was not wisdom. It was a decision made by a father who wanted one specific thing, for his son to know, unambiguously, what he was capable of without his father's name on the door, and who pursued that thing in a way that was clumsy and complicated and ultimately produced the result he wanted at a cost he is still accounting for. I know that Nathan sat in that orientation room and stared at a photograph of a 33-year-old man with a coffee cup in the morning sun and turned around slowly and found me in the back row, and that what he did next was turn back around and sit in his chair for 2 minutes and then walk to my seat and sit down and ask quietly, how long? That is his mother's composure. I know where he learned it. I know that Phil Garrett is worth every dollar I have paid him for 11 years, and several he has not been paid yet. I know that the Charlotte office has a technician retention problem we have been under-prioritizing, and that Nathan identified it in his first week and put a preliminary analysis in front of Phil without being asked, because that is how he works, and Phil sent it to me with a note that said, told you. I know that Karen would have told me to call him. She would have said, Douglas, call your son and tell him what is happening and work out the feelings after, because you cannot protect people from information and then expect them to trust you with it. She would have been right. She was right about most things. I am still learning which ones, 4 years after she is gone. I know that my father drove a delivery truck for 31 years and that I have never once been ashamed of it. I know that the coffee cup in the photograph at 33 years old is the same gesture as the cup I raised in the back row of that orientation room, and that the line between those 2 moments is everything I built and everything it cost and everything it was worth. I know that my son sat across from me at a table in Buckhead on a Thursday evening and paid the check and said he had a real job now, and I let him pay because he was right, and because Karen would have let him pay, and because some gestures are worth more than the amount on the receipt. The orientation was 2 weeks ago. Nathan has been in the Atlanta office every day since. He is learning the systems, learning the team, doing the work that a regional director does in the first 30 days, which is mostly listening and asking the right questions and not yet talking about what needs to change. He is doing it well. Phil sends me a note most days. Brief, usually one sentence. Today it was. He asked the Charlotte question in the pipeline meeting, and Garrett Walters didn't have a good answer. I read that note on my phone on the back porch of my house in Decatur, where Karen's garden is still growing in the way she intended, still producing things in the right season, still exactly as she left it, which I have maintained with the imperfect care of a man who knows which things deserve to be kept. I called Nathan that evening. We talked for 40 minutes, not about the company, about other things. I do not know what this looks like in 5 years or 10. I am not certain how the configuration of father and employer resolves itself over time, what it does to Sunday calls and holiday dinners, and the easy shorthand of two people who understand each other. I have thought about it. I do not have the answer. What I have is a son who got the job on his own, who sat in a room and stared at a photograph and turned around and found me and knew what he was looking at, who paid the check, who showed up on Monday morning and did the work. That is his, entirely. I am going to do my best to keep it that way. Karen would expect nothing less. I know what I am willing to build, and I know what was always worth more than the building. See you in the next one.